Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Kingdom of Dreams podcast, The Making of Stories. I'm your host, Jawad Mir. Today, my guest is Jim May. He's a film editor who's worked with a lot of amazing directors, including Michael Bay, Andrew Adamson, and a whole lot more. He used to work as a VFX editor, then he switched over to editing, and we had a wonderful talk, just not just about professional editing and films that he's worked on, specifically being the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but it's just a whole bunch of other stuff. I had a great time talking with him. So without further ado, here's my conversation with editor Jim May. I have grown up with the movies that you, Chris, Joel, William, and now he directed the most recent film, Unstoppable, which I
hmm
absolutely loved.
hmm
So you have, I mean, I say this to almost everybody whenever there's a chance. You have absolutely no idea how many lives you have impacted with the films that you have worked on, even if it's a camera operator or a focus puller or an editor. It's just for me, my entire life is films. And it's
Right.
very, and this is one of the reasons I do the podcast because I effing enjoy it because
Yeah.
that's my life. And to be part of, talking to people who I've sort of grown up with in a very strange way, it's very meaningful for me. So I'm really honored to have you and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I remember seeing the book for the very first time in library when I moved to Canada in early 90s, and then seeing a movie about it. It was just a joy. So honored to have you, sir.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. Again, honored to be here.
I would love to start off with talking about your career first. How did this bug of being in the film get started? What inspired you? What was the catalyst?
It's funny. It wasn't, you know, 40, 50 years ago, it wasn't like it is today with your phone could like make a movie. It was somebody in the neighborhood had to have a camera, either a 16 millimeter or more often a Super 8 camera. And my friend happened to have a Super 8 camera, and we discovered early on that you could crank it up and roll it back, at high speed, so that when you shot at high speed, it had really cool imagery on it, and it would roll back at slow motion. And so we decided to make a little film using my all my plastic models that I built together, plastic models of tanks and airplanes, and we had some fireworks. This was Colorado, so this was this was sort of a bit of the Wild West where I was living,
Hmm.
and we would blow up the models, and we created a little film we called Scenes from World War II, and it was just really an excuse to just sort of destroy and demolish these old models that I had had. And we kept it, sort of on the down low from my parents, and just went out and took the camera. And then at that point, then I realized the power of putting these images together. It was an involved process. You had to wait a few days, if not longer, to get the film back, and then you project it on a little projector, and you had to be very careful because if you tore the film, that was it. There was no copies of it. There was no negative. The Super 8 was what they called reversal film, so it just you processed it, and that was your only copy of it. Um, and Scenes from World War II needed some editing. So I got a little tiny tape splicer. And I mean, it's tiny. It's 8 millimeters. It is not a big piece of film.
Yeah.
But we had a little projector, and we were able to watch what we'd shot. And it just sort of got a bit of a bug there. And then next, Jawad, I got a job at a movie theater, which was sort of the local theater. It wasn't a small theater by any means, though. It was an exclusive house, 900 seats. It was the Continental Theater in Denver, Colorado. And this was where they had big premieres and, single showings, like the entire city. If you wanted to see the movie, at times you had to go to the Continental Theater. And it was just one of those classic movie houses, just huge lobby, huge concession stand, huge box office. And it was, again, sort of a bit of an honor to work there. Um, and I found when I was working there as what they called a doorman, which is essentially an usher. I had my red jacket and my bow tie, my black bow tie. What I found was that there were certain parts of certain movies that they had in house that I wanted to go back and watch again and again. And in some cases, like we played the movie Ron Howard's Cocoon was playing, and there was a joke. I don't know if you've seen Cocoon, but it was a
I
really
have.
brilliant movie on a lot of levels. It's complete Ron Howard. Right, just right at the height of sort of him, finding his footing as a director. And there was a line in there where Steve Guttenberg says, "If this is foreplay, I'm a dead man." and it was just the audience reaction was so fun to be a part of, especially when you had 800 people in there. The roar of the laughter from the audience when especially people who hadn't seen the movie yet was so fun and so cacophonous and so energetic and inspiring that I would go in there at times to just see well this is and at times if I had a couple hundred people in there the joke wouldn't play as well, but it was fascinating because I realized looking back at my time at a movie theater that I think that was part of what led me to be an editor or wanted to be an editor, was just that idea that you could go in and see how certain scenes, certain sections, certain edits would play, not just even from different audiences, but just for me, at different times of day, different times of, night. And it was just, I think that really led me to be able to sit in a dark room and watch certain scenes, certain edits, certain, films over and over and over again.
Amazing. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's funny you were talking about cutting 8 millimeter. I've done flatbed editing on 16 millimeter on the Bolex camera. My first film came out completely underexposed. My second film came out completely overexposed. But that's how you sort of learn, and you kind of figure. But I think the flatbed editing, which I never signed up to be an editor, I always wanted to be a director, but that somehow got into my head, and editing became like a huge part of me. Not anymore. I've sort of trying to dwindle away from it, but it's just a fascinating thing to know editing, because even as a director, you can just cut everything in your head as you're even lying down in bed and about to go to sleep, and you're thinking of a scene and how you're going to cut it this way or that way. But that's really fascinating. I appreciate you sharing that. That's really cool. It's always fun hearing where everything begins.
So, not to jump too far forward or too deep into our other conversations, but there was a scene in Narnia that Narnia, a longer story about how that movie got
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
broken up but between me and the other editor. But there was a scene in there because we had been on the movie for so long. Oh, probably by the time we had our first preview in an audience, in front of an audience in Los Angeles, we had been shooting for probably, or it had been since we'd started shooting about 15 months, which today is a really long time, extremely long time to wait to show the movie in front of an audience. And we had weekly or bi-weekly screenings, that the director wanted to have with friends and family. He'd bring them by the cutting room, but those weren't like an audience of 600
yeah.
people, 500 people. You didn't get the same reactions. And a lot of the people who came had seen the movie before. So we took the film out to Laverne, which is sort of in the San Gabriel Valley east of Los Angeles, and showed the movie. And there was a scene prior to that where I had to fight to keep this one beat in there. And I was convinced that it would get a laugh, but we really didn't know how big of a laugh because we were all so used to seeing this one beat in there. I don't know how well you remember the movie, but there's a beat where Lucy, the little girl,
Yeah,
steps through the wardrobe, goes into the Narnia for the first time, and is just
right.
wowed by it. I've got great stories about how that scene was shot and put together, by the way. But there's a beat where Mr. Tumnus or Lucy reaches out her hand to shake Mr. Tumnus's hand, and he has no idea what that means. So he stares there kind of blankly, staring at her, and we just hold on it. And I had producers, I had studio executives say, you got to cut that down. It's a little awkward. And I finally just said, look, I promise if this doesn't get a laugh, I promise we will pare it down. We will take seconds off of this edit but just can I just play it and then we'll see what happens. And it worked really well. Same thing, got gangbusters response, almost like the Cocoon response. And because people got it, they understood this little girl is trying to shake his hand. He has no idea what's happening here. There's this awkward beat. And it was really, Jawad, it was a very satisfying moment to know that again, this single piece of editing had survived for that long a time. And and the director let us try it and see what happened. And it was one of those things where I just recognized, wow, this takes me back to going in the movie theater, and we're just kind of like getting a sense of what does it take to pace a little comic moment like that? What does it take to sort of get an audience and suck them in, pull the rubber band a little bit, and then when do you release the rubber band? I think that's a lot of what editing is. It's just
Yeah,
the timing of that sort of stuff, and finding that timing in it, because it's you can previs the movie, you can storyboard the movie, but but there's a lot of that just can't be, figured out until you actually have the footage and can try it and time it and get it in front of people.
100%. And, over the last 15, 20 years, one of the things that I've learned is sometimes and editing is not about cutting, but it's about holding.
Yeah.
That reaction, whether it's somebody crying or whether it's somebody laughing or that little pause for people to think, without a piece of word really kicks in. And audiences are smart. They
Oh yeah.
really, they get pulled out of the movie when there's a cut. Have you heard Francis Ford Coppola's story about Godfather 2?
I'm not sure if I have.
So, you know how it goes back and forth, right?
Yep.
So he was like, when they first did the screening, people hated the film, Godfather Part 2. And he was underneath his bed, like really trying to figure out what had happened. He was really stressed out, anxiety. And then him and his editor, all they had to do was extend each period from 10 minutes to 20 minutes. And that pulled the audience in because the audience
Interesting.
wanted to be in that world a little longer before being cut to the other world.
Yeah.
But that's the magic of editing.
Yeah. Well, and he also had the advantage that the audience had already been sort of
Yeah,
immersed in that world in the first
true.
movie. So on some levels, the audience was already along for the ride when you came in to see Godfather 2.
Yeah,
There was another example, though, Joe, of what you're talking about, the hold, where on a film I worked on called Nonstop, and
yeah.
Liam Neeson and I forget the other actor who
Is
was
that the
who was
train one? The one
no,
there, or is
that's
that the
the airplane one.
commuter? Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Yes, that's the
commuter was
commuter.
nonstop on a train.
Got it. Got it.
So yes, it was the one on the airplane that's that gets hijacked, and
Yeah.
Liam Neeson plays a federal air marshal. At one point, Julianne Moore approaches him. They've just gotten on the plane. Julianne Moore approaches him and says, "Hey, can I maybe switch seats with you?" And Liam Neeson has already had this run-in with the actor who's sitting next ends up sitting next to him, and Liam Neeson looks over and just stares at him for a second, and it was the same thing that you were talking about. There's just a hold there, and hold and a hold, and waiting for this guy to basically get up and give his seat away, and I held it much longer than you would normally do, and it was the same sort of response. The audience, like you said, they're smart. You've already set it up with this confrontation at the TSA line, and they got it. And it got like a great response, and even better than I thought it would get. And I just remember thinking, man, there's a real power to just letting good actors and letting these beats kind of hold. And there was no dialogue. It's just Liam Neeson staring at the guy for a second, and as the seconds go on, and the guy is like he's saying, I'm waiting for you to get up and leave. You need to like change seats with this woman. And it was just a little beat that was kind of like
Yeah.
improvised almost. And just the editing, the Avid allowed us to just sort of stretch it out and turn it into something that wasn't there. It was never going to be a funny moment. It was really going to be just a moment where he looks over, the guy gets up and moves his seat. But it was kind of nice to be able to add that beat in there, have it
That's
work.
awesome. Yeah, 100%. And before I ask you how you got on the Narnia Lion, Witch, the Wardrobe, I specifically remembered. So was I think it came out after Harry Potter, right? Like when the fantasy and Lord of the Rings was
Yes.
yeah. I remember while when you told me that about opening the wardrobe, it hit me that I remember watching the teaser, the very first teaser that came out, and I still think it's one of the most amazing teasers because it ends at the wardrobe, right? And like you don't know what's there to expect afterward. I was really pulled in with that, and I thought it was really brilliantly marketed. But just wanted to point that out. Tell me how you got onto the film, the very first one.
I got onto the film through a executive. She's now an executive at Universal. She's the head of visual effects at Universal. Her name's Jennifer Bell. She had worked with the director and the editor back in the days when the director, a man named Andrew Adamson, who came
Shrek.
up through visual
Yeah.
effects and then through animation, they'd worked together at a visual effects facility like years and years and years prior to that. And then Andrew just through sheer, he's a New Zealander and just a wonderful gentleman, and through sheer just sort of persistence and intelligence and guidance, and again political savvy, and also vision. I mean, he's a very creative gentleman, and I think through the ranks of the VFX, I think people saw that this was a gifted gentleman. So when he he got into the Shrek world and started, sort of overseeing those. I think people recognized here's somebody who's got something. So he went and pitched to Disney, but also Walden Media, who was tied in with the estate of C.S. Lewis, the author
Mm-hmm.
of the original Chronicles of Narnia books. Um, uh, Andrew was able to, basically sell them on this huge budget movie. This was a $175 million movie back in 2004. This was not a cheap movie to make. And I know Disney was very nervous, as I'd worked on several Disney movies up at, to that point, Armageddon, Pearl Harbor, and
Yeah.
several of the executives were very concerned about the budget on this film, and having a first time director down there shooting this movie. And they're in New Zealand. There wasn't going to be a whole lot of studio oversight, and I don't think they like that. And so on certain levels, they like to be kind of involved and part of the process. But in Andrew, they had a director who was extremely confident and really, I don't think had any qualms or any concerns about how this was going to come off. And they started off putting it together like a an animated feature on certain levels. They built what they call a story reel, which is built with a collection of storyboards that you sort of dissolve from one to the other. And
Mm-hmm.
then in certain cases, they had a whole previs team creating the entire sequences, because some of the more complicated sequences were hard to board, would have been really complicated to storyboard. And previs was happening then, but it wasn't as pervasive as it is now, and as sort of widespread as it is now. I mean, now previs there's entire companies that's all they do. We had an entire unit that was in New Zealand and been working up in Burbank, where they had a DreamWorks office working on the film, um, and they were putting it together, for probably a good year before the shoot started. So they had a good blueprint for the film. What they didn't have was a an editor who had a lot of live action and in my case visual effects experience. And I had been a visual effects editor for years, and that before starting to get into like feature film cutting. So um, I think they wanted I have to sort of step back for a second and tell you that I was actually the second editor on Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The lead editor was Sim Evan Jones, who had worked with Andrew, the director, on multiple Shrek movies and stuff, and they had gone back for years. So when I came on, that was my role, was to basically be the guy who had done some live action stuff, but mainly was bringing like a visual effects editor, knack to the process as well. Um, my friend, she was our visual effects producer on Van Helsing, the film I was on when I got the call. Went in and met both of them, and they recognized my enthusiasm for one, working with them. I was a big fan of the Shrek franchise, but also just the idea that we could move down to New Zealand for months and work remotely like that, or work, that far away for a while. I honeymooned in New Zealand, so I was very familiar with the country, and I just, fell in love with it on my honeymoon. So for me, it just was a wonderful opportunity. So I kind of begged to join them on the film, and said, look, I will take on whatever role you needed. And they were convinced. They brought me on. But then here's what happened, Jawad, is kind of interesting. I went down there kind of not fully knowing what my role was going to be, but shortly after we started shooting first unit, they added a second unit, and I got to tell you that the shooting schedule on the film was 172 days or something. That's for first unit. So second unit was essentially coming on a few weeks after that, maybe 6, 7 weeks after that, and was shooting concurrently the same amount of footage. It was all shot on film. So you can imagine how much footage was
Wow.
coming through. And at one point, I think Sim, the lead editor, recognized, yeah, Jim, you and I just do the movie. Let's just make this happen. And, obviously a great uh, boon to me to be able to, like, and a great honor to have him kind of like take me on as his co-editor. And the what we realized was, again, that we started off early on just both taking swipes at some of these scenes, like the scene where the family gets on the train early on, the train in London, And they have an awkward moment with some of the other kids in the train car and stuff. And Sim and I both took a pass at that, and then we ended up showing that to the director. And at one point, Andrew, the director, turned and said, "Look, guys, I can't do this for every scene. I can't have like a bake off between each of the scenes." And he was right, and it didn't make sense. And so again, Sim, thought, "Well, I'll tell you what, let's checkerboard it." And that way, rather than having to sort of edit to keep up the camera all the time, if you need a few days to work on a scene, which in some cases, some of these scenes needed a lot of TLC, we were able to take the time to do that and not so much worry about keeping up the camera because there were two of us. You know what I mean? So the checkerboarding of the scenes ended up being a really wonderful way of doing it. For example, Sim had a scene. We were probably 2/3 of the way through the production, and Sim took on this scene that just ended up being extremely involved. The scene where Aslan gets sacrificed at the altar, and there's just
Mm.
a bunch of coverage and a bunch of coverage of all the characters sort of chanting and rooting for Aslan to get sacrificed, and the queen eventually, picks up the sword and does her business. But the scene was extremely complicated. Again, tons of cameras shooting over the course of, I don't know, a week of just footage pouring in. And for Sim to have tried to like just sort of, throw that together was not going to happen. He needed time to work on it. And so there were smaller scenes coming from second unit, smaller beats coming from second unit, and I was able to sort of pick those up and let Sim do his thing and really focus on the scene, like focus on it, like get married to it for a week. And you can see it in the final film how effective that scene is, but it's largely because he had time to work on it like that, while we were shooting. Um, so again, I think the role kind of evolved over the first few weeks when I came on, and we were still trying to figure out what it was going to be. And then once we all settled into kind of this, like I said, checkerboarding of the various scenes, then we kind of moved into the place where I was accepted as a co-editor on the film, and we didn't look back there. And like other people you've talked to, other editors you've talked to, Chris, Billy, Joel, these guys can all point to one or two films in their career that was a bit of a turning point for them, a seminal part of their career. And I would say The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for me was that turning point, because I was, I'd worked in that capacity. I cut feature films myself, but they're all much smaller. And this film ended up being not just a tremendous responsibility and tremendous sort of the opportunity, but then the response to it was pretty phenomenal. The film ended up being a huge hit, and it just it's funny when you get one of those on your resume, how your career changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always about that one project that turns the
Yep.
tables for you.
Yep.
Amazing. No, that's really, really cool stuff that you shared. Thank you so much. And I looked up your IMDb and you talked about it too, that how you were a VFX editor. That transition, you don't still do that, right? You're more on just on the editing side, correct?
Yeah. No, I haven't been a VFX editor for 20
Yeah.
years.
Did you ever miss that once you became an editor?
Well, it's funny because there were times, and this has happened in the last few projects, where uh, I would quickly put together a little composite of images on the Avid. Avid allows you to do that, do
Hmm.
quick visual effects, cheap and quick sort of representations of what the visual effects is going to look like. And I would show that to the director and the editor, and the director would say, "Wow, that's interesting that you can do that." And I said, "Well, that was my past. That's what I used to do." So it's for me a sort of old hat. So it's kind of fun to have that kind of that experience in that past. But no, I haven't really been a visual effects editor for, like I said, over 20 years, closer to
Yeah.
25 years. But it definitely helps to have that experience. And it's interesting in hearing some of your other editors on your podcast. They talked about their paths and how they got into editing, and I'm sure for most of them, the ones that I've listened to at least, they all work their way up from the standard sort of cutting room hierarchy that
Yeah.
happens: the apprentice or the production assistant, then the apprentice editor, and then the second assistant editor, then the first assistant editor, and then you get a chance to co-edit on a certain project where the editor gives you a chance and offers you a break, and then from there you're able to sort of take off and find your own director to work with, or you keep working with that same editor who gave you the initial opportunity. My path is definitely different. There's not many visual effects editors who have worked their way from being a visual effects editor then kind of jumping on to a film as an editor. It doesn't happen that often. I mean, Conrad Buff, I know, started in visual effects, and he and I had a similar path. I followed his sort of trajectory a little bit, or his path. Again, not on his level, but I did work at ILM, and I know that he worked at ILM when on the first, I think it was the Return of the Jedi films and the Empire Strikes Back, and then he was able to wrangle that and turn that into a career as a very successful editor. Um, for me, it was working on, as a visual effects editor, working on these huge budget visual effects films like Armageddon, like Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
like The Mummy, and so it was sort of being in that space at the right time, but also just like sort of, you know, being able to interact with the editor, interact with the directors to the point I think where they could see that like the pressure was something that we could handle, and I was able to kind of wrangle that and convince somebody over at Jerry Bruckheimer Films to get me a job as a third editor on a film, and I also had to wrangle the visual effects at the same time. So I wasn't free and clear of it yet, but it was a film called Kangaroo Jack. It was a Jerry Bruckheimer film.
Yeah.
I was the visual effects editor, but then also the third editor on that film. That's where I met Billy Goldenberg, was to work with him on that movie.
That's so
Again,
amazing.
not a usual path for most editors to
Yeah,
go from
yeah,
the next
it's
world
very
into that world.
different.
Yeah.
Very different. So, we talked about how you got inspired to be who you are today. We talked about how you got into Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe, the Narnia films. But that first bridge that you have to cross to get a project to for people to sort of start seeing you. And what was that journey like? Was that, just to get your first film and for the world to see it, a major film or a small film, working with producers or directors? If you can just sort of run that by me, I would love to hear that story.
The very first one, or you're talking about the ones after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
No, no, before that. So
Before that.
before you were even like a VFX editor, just to kind of break through into the industry, right? And just
Yeah,
have you to be involved in projects.
gotcha. Um, the VFX, again, the VFX features that I was on, I was at ILM for a while before moving
Mm,
back down to Los Angeles. And I had happened to land at ILM at a really opportune time. The first film I worked on was Terminator 2. And then, that was the time when ILM, I think, won 4 Oscars in a row for visual
mm,
effects. And so to be in that environment gave me a chance to basically, be at the Harvard of visual effects facilities. And so when I came back down to Los Angeles, that carried with it a certain panache. Anyway, even though I was just one of, a crew of, 20 visual effects editors up there and assistant editors. So, but I had the advantage to be able to, a lot of people at ILM are, they've been up there for years, and they were, had said their families there, their kids went to school and stuff, and they didn't have the flexibility that I did to move sort of back and forth between Los Angeles and San Francisco, or, Marin County. So when I came back down, Harvard visual effects degree in hand, I was able to wrangle that a little bit. I worked at Sony ImageWorks for a little while. Sony ImageWorks was just getting started at the time on the Sony lot, and I was able to kind of come in there, work in their sort of newfound and ad hoc editorial department, which was great. Had a chance to meet some Sony executives, and then at one point, I had a friend who was a high-ranking visual effects executive, again, visual effects executive at Disney, and he knew Frank Marshall, Kathleen Kennedy. He'd worked with them for years, a guy named Art Rapola, and he recommended me to be a visual effects editor on a film that Frank Oz was directing called The Indian in the Cupboard.
one of
So
my favorite
again,
films.
yeah, and again, Frank Oz is just, I'm being dunked into this situation where my first, visual effects editor feature is just with some of my heroes. Frank Oz again is just an amazing gentleman to work with, and again, Kennedy Marshall at the time was just doing groundbreaking, and yet you've got your Spielberg there in front of you, just groundbreaking stuff. And they just, everything they're doing was like turned to gold in terms of people coming and watching their films and stuff. So for me, it was just like this huge opportunity to drop in. And I know you talked about sort of the various platforms people cut on. That was on the Lightworks That was the only show I'd ever worked on with the Lightworks, which is kind of fascinating. Everything else had been Avid since then.
Mm.
Um, and because of that role, I got several different visual effects editing jobs afterwards. And it's just the people that you meet along the way, Gerard, you know. And there was a guy who was producing a really small budget film who just I happened to run into at some, like he had seen some party or something, and he had seen the Indian in the cupboard and thought the visual effects were great and asked about how that was done and like how did they do this? Did it work? Did it, how they shoot it? And he and I started talking. He said, "Well, so what's your deal? Are you always going to be a visual effects editor?" I said, "No, actually, I'd really like to like edit. That's kind of interesting to me. I'd done editing in film school. I'd edited something, believe it or not, on the Edit Droid when I was at ILM, a baseball documentary, a short like 30-minute baseball documentary that a friend had shot. And ILM was great at the time because they would let you just use equipment. If you wanted to use equipment at night or on the weekends, they were just like, if the equipment's just sitting there, go ahead. And I learned the Edit Droid, taught myself the Edit Droid, and used that to cut this documentary. So it was out there. People knew that I was looking to cut stuff, kind of anything. And this producer, got the sense that I was enthusiastic and looking to cut in my spare time. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come interview for this feature with the director?" So I came over and met the director. And the budget on this movie was $500,000. It was being shot on Digibeta. It was like uh, to say it was low budget is an understatement. They were paying me, I think, $100 a week. I mean, just something
Oh
like
wow.
insane. This wasn't what you call tier one. This was underground,
Uh,
low budget.
yeah.
And then it was called Cookers. And it was a really small budget film, again, about these three people who hole up in an abandoned house. They shot it up in Oxnard, sort of in an abandoned house. And it was one of those weird sort of lightning in a bottle things where the director and the writer and the producer, they just all found this crazy weird tone to this thing. And it was kind of a joy to work on. It actually ended up being a really fun project and ended up launching careers for some of the actors. And for me, we won several awards actually for editing, not just for the film itself, but also for editing. And it went to certain horror film, film festivals. And that then in turn, when that happened, I had several people that I'd worked with prior to that. The Michael Bays and Bob Doucet, who's an editor friend who had hired me to work on Steve Summers' film called Deep Rising. I think what happens is they recognize that this is something you're not gonna. It's a handle you're not going to let go of. This is something that you've got it in your blood. You want to do it, and if you're going to go do this in your spare time, your weekends, and get paid $100 a week to go do this, then I think people sense that enthusiasm are looking to kind of help you get a leg up,
Yeah.
and that's I think that's what happened is because then those same people, Bob Doucet, ended up bringing me on to Van Helsing as a third editor. Michael Bay ended up hiring me after Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe to be one of the editors on. He had just formed this small production company called Platinum Dunes with a couple partners of his, Brad Fuller and Andrew Form, and those ended up being kind of perfect for guys like me, guys like Joel Negron, guys like Roger Barton, because they were low budget. The directors are usually commercial directors, and Michael was able to sort of oversee them and make sure that nothing went haywire. And he was very interested in who the editors were, and because he and I had a really good relationship coming off of Armageddon, coming off of Pearl Harbor. Michael was okay with putting me in the editor's seat on films like that. I did six of those movies with Michael, six of the Platinum Dunes movies with Michael.
Which one were they?
Let's see, I did sort of a funny project to leap onto after the Narnia films, the child, the PG
Hmm.
movies. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning,
Mm.
I did that one. I worked on The Hitcher, worked on a film called Horseman, worked on both of the Ninja Turtles movies that Michael in Platinum
Oh
Dunes
right.
did. Yeah, and then I worked on the first Purge film as well
Okay.
with
Well, that's
various
that that
crop.
that that part I missed on IMDb. But you were talking about VFX early days Terminator. So do you know Steven Rosenbaum?
Uh, I don't just know Steve Rosenbaum. I love Steve Rosenbaum. He and I were
There you
friends
go.
for a long time. We were on a basketball team together. Yeah, he and I go way back. And he was
Yeah,
one of those eight guys on Terminator 2. Who was one of those eight visual effects supervisors they had up there that ended up just doing this
yeah.
groundbreaking work. Yeah.
I've spoken to him so many times. I just spoke to him last week about Avatar. I've had John Rosengrant on for Jurassic Park, Terminator 1, Terminator 2. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Again, I was said earlier that all these films that you're talking about, it's just, like mouth-watering, even to this day. And one of the key things that you said, having that enthusiasm to work on a project regardless of the budget. I mean, that's something I think I say this to everybody, including my son. I retell this to myself every day, even at this point in my career. Attitude is everything. Not talent doesn't mean shit if you don't have attitude, a proper
Yeah.
attitude and work ethic. So you have to have a good attitude, and that pays dividends in long term. It may not do it right away, but it does certainly do that.
Yeah. And I think if you look back at Armageddon, it was one of those rare things. Again, it was the highest budget film that Disney had greenlit up to that point. I don't remember what the budget was, probably like $130 million or something like that, which was outlandish at the time. But, obviously Jerry Bruckheimer was overseeing it. And this was, I think, his third or fourth movie with Michael Bay. And it was just, they had an amazing cast, Bruce Willis, a young Ben Affleck. And it just was like a synthesis of all these like great things coming together with that. But because of people like Roger Barton, Joel Negron, Todd Miller, me, Jawad, we pulled. I personally pulled 10 all-nighters on that film over the course of the last, 6 months, and 10 all-nighters meaning getting into work at 8 in the morning, working all night long, and showing the movie to, I don't know, some producer or Jerry or something the next morning. And I couldn't get enough of it. I was so enthusiastic. I was so thrilled to be working on that movie in that environment. My office was again, I was what they call the supervising visual effects editor. So I was overseeing this whole network of 16 different visual effects facilities, providing shots for the 1,600 films that or 1,600 shots that ended up in the film at the end of the day. Jerry Bruckheimer would come in from the garage. His office is connected to his garage. He'd walk in and he'd always stop in my room, always, every morning, and say, "What do you got for me? What do you got?" Because he knew he was so interested in the visual effects and so curious. Like he knew how cool these visual effects were going to be. He knew that they were groundbreaking. They eventually got nominated for an Oscar in
Hmm.
their own right. And it was, again, I look back and I think I'm amazed that I wasn't like, wiping tears away because, at one time he brought in Jackie Chan and Jackie Chan came and said, "Oh my God, this is this. You guys do the cool stuff." I was like, "Jackie Chan, you do the cool stuff, but thank you. But let me check out this shot that we just got from Dream Quest." I mean, it was one of those times where it was sort of, again, lightning in a bottle. You could just sense it. Movie was going to be big. Uh, and you know how I knew it was going to be big was the week before it opened. Somebody was doing a stock report, and they were talking about Disney stock, and they said, "And Disney stock is waiting anxiously for the release of Armageddon this week." And I thought, wow, something I've been working on, buried in the dark room, for a year, is actually going to potentially affect Disney stock. And I thought that's kind of cool to think about.
It is
Um,
cool, and it is cool. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, and then I think, there are a lot of these editors, their names I've mentioned are all working, all very successful, all not just, sort of B-list, but A-list editors, I think, because we were all in the foxhole together, and these people learned from, that experience. It was a pretty brutal experience. Again, you don't want to stay up all night very often. I worked 78 days in a row on that film without a break, meaning every day, not a day off for 78 days in a row. But again, I think we all saw that this was sort of this group camaraderie that fed off itself, fed off each other. And a lot of those people, again, I think have become very successful because they shared that enthusiasm, shared that work ethic. And I think somebody like Michael Bay sensed that, the film was successful because so many of the people, and I'm only really talking about assistants and VFX assistants and stuff. I'm not really talking
For
even
sure.
about the editors. At times we had six editors, like picture editors, cutting away on that film. Um, so it was insane, and the insanity of it was on some levels kind of cathartic, if that's
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah, no, the thing is that with films like Armageddon, Indian in the Cupboard, I mean, even to this day, the visual effects of those films are far more superior. That, like, I mean, I'm not trying to put down any film, but I
No, of
haven't
course
seen
not.
the film. I just saw the trailer of Lilo and Stitch, the live action one, and I just didn't buy it. The visual effects for me didn't do it. I
You mean the
did
look of them, or
no, just the
got
blending
it?
of the real world versus to me. But I did really the How to Train Your Dragon live action trailer really clicked with me because I felt like they were in the same frame. And maybe it's just me, but the point I'm trying to make is that majority of the films in the 90s, especially with great directors like Michael Bay, Steven Spielberg, you know, even producers like Jerry Bruckheimer had really good Frank Oz really good visual effects blending in with the real world. And I think that's where people sort of connect at a deeper level with the characters is through that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. I agree. I think it's a real, it's a real art. The ability to take it and make it look real. You know what I mean? I
Yeah,
think there's still for me. I have a harsh eye towards visual effects. It doesn't take much for me to kind of tune out watching, certain things that are
yeah,
done well. And because of that, when I see something like, and I'm just one example, Dune 2, and I see those worms pop out of the sound and my jaw hits the sand, they drop out of the sand.
yeah,
My jaw hits the floor, and I just think, I know how they did this, and yet I can't fathom how complicated this was to make this look so real. I mean, you're just convinced that that is really happening. It's always so impressive to me when they're able to do that. One more thing about Michael, I do have to say this, and obviously I'm biased, but I think at times Michael, his reputation in the business, and he's definitely has a bit of a reputation. I will see whatever Michael Bay movie comes out because guy's visual style is so jaw-droppingly unique, but also his knack for visual effects. Again, I'm biased. I sat in the room with him while he talked to ILM or talked to his visual effects supervisors. It was like watching an artist do his thing. And I don't want to overstate it, but I think I would
yeah.
watch some of those Transformers film and
Oh,
just again, my jaw was on the floor. I couldn't believe one that he hasn't won multiple Oscars for his visual effects work, because that's all him. That's all you sit in the room with him. I did on, like I said, Armageddon, Pearl Harbor. It was actually kind of fascinating because the editors wouldn't join us for that. It would just be me and Michael, and he would be on what they call the CineSync, with the talking to ILM, and
yeah,
he'd
yeah,
grab the pencil and circle and say, "No, no, I want this plane flying here. I want this happening like this, and this boat needs to come in here." And it was mesmerizing to be to be sitting there and watching him, talk at that level and with that level of complexity and get what he wanted. He was very uncompromising with his visual effects, and it shows in his work.
100%. I mean, I wasn't a fan of Pearl Harbor movie, but the trailer for Pearl Harbor with the music of Hans Zimmer from The Thin Red Line and the speech by the president and the baseball pitcher throwing the ball and the
Yep,
plane going.
yep,
I
yep,
mean, every one of those shots in that trailer is just mind-boggling,
yeah.
and the way he paces them. It's funny. You're talking about Breckheimer and Michael Bay. I had Mark Mancina on, the composer for Bad Boys
Oh, right, right, right.
and Speed. And I'll send you the link. He had a funny story about Jerry Bruckheimer, how he would just kind of sit there because Mark Mancina wasn't Mark Mancina at the time. It was his first film, and he would just try to like overlook him and making him push more and more. And these people like Jerry Bruckheimer, Michael Bay, they come across as very tough customers, but it's for the betterment of the film, right? That's
Yeah,
the goal. It's nothing personal. That's
yeah,
all it is.
yeah. There was I forget, I think it was Washington Post, New York Times, uh, reporter was in talking to Michael about it and asked him point blank about his reputation as a tough guy to work with. And I was sitting in the room with him, and that when he asked that, and he kind of looked at me sort of slyly, and then talked to the reporter and said, "Look, I everything I do is in service to the movie. It's all I push people hard because these are hard movies. These are hard things to do. These are tough movies to make." And I think he honestly believes that, and especially when it came to visual effects, which I was intimately involved with on those films. I think he felt like if he like let down his standards, that the standards would drop accordingly. And I
Of
think he
course.
felt like, if somebody from Ireland brought him something that was sort of substandard to him and below his standards, that the whole process would slip below a certain line. And so it was always like, don't bring me something that's going to suck. It's you're wasting my time. We're just not at that level. We're at a very high level, and I expect that. And just to see the way that he would push people, yes, hard to deal with. But again, having done 8 movies with the guy, clearly I have a ton of respect for the way that he operates. And he's not cranking out movies the way he used to, but I'm still looking forward to what he's doing next
Oh,
whenever it
so
comes
am
out.
I. I loved Ambulance.
Yeah,
I wasn't too crazy about in the beginning the drone shots, but the film itself was fabulous, the drama and everything. And I think I saw yesterday he's working on a documentary of I don't know what's it called. You know those guys that jump from building to building, like they have
parkour,
this. Yeah,
parkour. Yeah,
yeah, he's directing that without being ever present at location. So he's working on a documentary. But yeah, there's some names that I would watch even if it's terrible because that's just who I grew up with and what I like, and I appreciate every little frame that comes in, the sound,
yeah,
the visuals, and everything. But yeah, no, we talked less about Narnia, which is fine because I really got to know your work and who you are, and it's really fascinating hearing, like I said earlier, these stories because it's something I relate to too. Like, we always tend to forget where people come from because they're at a certain level. Like, okay, well, they must have gotten it easy. And that doesn't work like that. You got to work through so much crap to be where you are, and you're still working through crap. It's just part of life, but you
yeah,
enjoy that, and that's what matters the most.
yeah, absolutely. I did want to say something also about mentors too. I mean, working through
Please.
craft's a big part of it, but I've had, and I think some of the other editors that you've had on your podcast would say the same thing, and DPs and composers. I mean, I think mentors is something that just can't be overemphasized. I've had people who recognized, again, not a talent necessarily from me, but just an enthusiasm and a work ethic and just a love of this part of the process, the post process. And I've loved it since, again, like I said, I was a little boy. And then in film school, that was always my favorite. Those were my favorite classes: the editing classes, the sound classes, the post production classes. And I think having those people who recognize that in you, like a Bob Doucet, who was again an editor I've worked with, I think on 6 films now, and he has made me a co-editor on certain projects that he worked with. Just I think because not only were we friends, went to each other's weddings, etc., but also I think he just recognized that, like him, I have this burning desire to just make movies better. Which and as you know, Jawad, editing can make movies much better depending on the project.
Yeah.
But it's somebody like, Jerry Bruckheimer, this guy named Pat Sanson, who was Jerry's post-production supervisor. He really did grab me after Pearl Harbor and said, I want you to stay with us here at Bruckheimer's. And he put me on as the third editor on Kangaroo Jack. It's people like that in your career who just basically not just give you a leg up, but in some cases can really make a huge difference in your
For
career.
sure.
So
Oh,
yes to enthusiasm, yes to who this person is individually, and there's obviously some luck involved too, and being in the right place at the right time. But I definitely have mentors, and I know that Billy Goldenberg, for example, in your podcast mentioned Michael Kahn,
yeah.
and Billy wouldn't be he's the first to admit it, he wouldn't be in the position he was today if Michael Kahn hadn't seen in him that enthusiasm, but also vouched for him to go on and work on some of the films that he did. And I think all of us can point to certain mentors, and I could point to about 5 or 6 of them that I would point to and say, I couldn't have done this without these guys looking out for me.
That's amazing. It's beautiful to hear that. And what would you say to sort of wrap things up? How do you, for people who are watching and listening, how do you find a mentor? Does it come to you if you work hard? Is that it?
I think that's a good chunk of it. Yeah. I think some of it's kismet, some of it's fate, some of it's just right place, right time. I have a guy, I'm not going to mention his name, but
Sure.
a guy that I worked with on a film called Ghosted, and then I stole him. I stole him to come work on Candy Cane Lane, this guy, because he's just got that juice, that enthusiasm, that I will cut your sizzle reel. I will take the marketing tools and put together my own trailer. I will cut together like a little gag reel for the studio wrap party. and just somebody who just dives in, weds themselves to the project, and just you can't peel them away from it. And I'm not talking hours wise. I'm not talking about all nighters necessarily. I'm talking about just has that enthusiasm for the film. And I think you can find that sometimes in somebody who's a production assistant who's taught themselves Premiere Pro and wants to like take clips from the film and put it in Premiere Pro. And as an editor, and I know a lot of editors do the same thing. I'll encourage any assistant, any visual effects person, anybody to go cut a scene. If they've got access to the footage, go for it. Like, why not? You know what I mean? Because I think that that's what we're looking for is people who share that enthusiasm. It just makes the movie better. If somebody comes and brings a scene to me or to the director and shows, well, obviously you want to come through me first before they show it to the director. But if they have an idea, you know, best idea wins. I'm not it's not a democracy, but at the same time, it's I think you want people like that who are gonna like work really hard and have that enthusiasm. I think it makes a big difference. So I've been on both sides of the mentor part of it, and it's a joy to have those people, you know, in your cutting room, you know, in your environment.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful advice. Thank you so much. It's been amazing to chat with you.
You as
Um,
well.
whenever things get a little bit more calmer with you, or whenever you have time, as many times as you would like, I would love to have you because for me, this podcast obviously is, enthusiasm and exciting, but I learn so much every day when I talk to people like yourself. So doors always open, and I will reach out if you have time. Please do come back. I'd love to have you.
I, as you can tell, I can talk about this for hours, so probably
I
too
know,
much.
and
But again,
yeah,
it's an honor to talk with you. And if you're in Los Angeles, please look me up or let me know because I would join you for a cup of coffee with some of the other people you've talked about on the show and
I would
just
love to.
catch up there.